the Cold War. So it starts in Europe, right? That's in the aftermath of World War II. That's kind of the focus of everything, and that makes sense because it's a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies. So naturally, we tend to focus on Europe first, but we have started to sort of zoom out in a way and take in the Cold War as it unfolded in the rest of the world, whether it's China, Korea, Vietnam, so on and so forth. So yesterday we were trying to reinforce this idea that the Cold War was a worldwide phenomenon. It's something that where the entire world ends up being forced to kind of choose sides, in a sense. Which side are they going to lean toward in this struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States? So what we're going to do today is sort of look at another example of a Cold War conflict that illustrates this idea, except now we're going to move into the Western Hemisphere and look at Latin America, in particular Cuba. So Cuba, if you don't know, is right here. Okay. The first thing that should strike you is that it's close to the United States, and that's a major factor in explaining why the Cuban Missile Crisis was such a big deal. Thus far, we've been talking about conflicts and wars that were far away. This one is close, and so it gives it a different feel from the American point of view anyway. So to begin with, let's talk about and introduce Fidel Castro, Cuba, what's going on in Cuba. So Fidel Castro, there's a picture of Castro, let me back up. Before talking about Castro himself, we need to say what's going on in Cuba. So between the years 1952 to 1959, in Cuba, there was a dictatorship. Cuba was ruled by a corrupt dictator named Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a dictator in Cuba. He was corrupt. By that I mean he took bribes from American companies. He was abusive towards the Cuban people. Didn't care at all about conditions for ordinary Cuban people. There were many Cubans who were very, very poor. They lived and worked in rural areas. It wasn't a great place to live, but of course the dictator Batista and his buddies were living quite nicely. Pretty standard kind of setup. You see this throughout history around the world, unfortunately, and Cuba is no different. Okay, the corrupt dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista from 1952 to 1959. So this is what's going on in Cuba in, say, 59. A lot of people were unhappy, including Castro. Okay, Fidel Castro, who you see pictured up here on the board. Fidel Castro is going to be a key figure in Cuba in these years. So Castro was college educated, middle class. Okay, Castro's not a poor guy who's working out in the sugar or fruit plantations in remote Cuba. He was college educated, came from a pretty good family, a family who had done fairly well under the Batista regime, as a matter of fact. But he also came to adhere to the ideas of socialism. Okay, so he's college educated, middle class, but socialist. He's also a nationalist. Okay, a nationalist, someone who loves Cuba, who is Cuban, who speaks Spanish, who loves Cuba, who wants the best for Cuba, who believes that Cuba ought to be independent and strong, and on all of these kind of things. In Cuba, that meant he was anti-Yankee. You know what Yankee refers to here? So that's like a Spanish way of spelling this. Yankee. Should I zoom? I think I will. There we go. Anti-Yankee. Yankee means American. So in Cuba, there was a lot of resentment toward America. The United States had, American businesses had set up operations in Cuba. Sugar plantations, fruit plantations, hotels and casinos. Cuba was a really attractive vacation spot in the 50s for Americans. It was sort of like Florida for a lot of people. Families would take vacations there. So you have these big American companies make a lot of money. Meanwhile, regular Cuban people aren't living too well. So there's a lot of anti-American resentment. Castro is one of the people who is anti-Yankee. He's a nationalist. He's pro-Cuban, anti-American, and he's a socialist. So, like socialists do around the world, he launched a revolution. Okay. In 1959, 58 actually is when the revolution began. The revolutionaries in Cuba fought guerrilla style, right? We've talked about this before. Batista, the dictator, he controls the army, right? He's the man who's in power. He has a huge advantage, Batista's regime, because he has the guys with uniforms and guns and trucks and all of that. Castro and his socialist buddies, they don't have nearly the same equipment. They're much smaller force, but they can use those hit-and-run tactics like we've talked about. So they're very effective, Castro and his fellow rebels, at fighting against, in this guerrilla style, against the Batista regime, because they're trying to overthrow Batista. That's the point of the revolution, okay, is to kick out Batista and establish a new government. By January 1st, 1959, January 1st, 1959, Castro and the socialists were successful in overthrowing Batista. Castro's army marched into Havana. Havana is the capital. January 1st, 1959, the Cuban Revolution, the socialist revolution in Cuba is successful, and Castro takes over. Okay. One of the very first things that Castro did, because now he's in charge, basically, because he's the leader of the revolution, is that he began to seize Cuban and American-owned property and businesses. Okay. He took the sugar plantations, took control of them. These are farms. When I say plantation, I mean farm. That's what you call it in the Caribbean or in Central America. He took the sugar farms. He took the fruit farms. He took control of the hotels and the casinos and all of the businesses in order to take the wealth that's associated with them. He's a socialist after all, right? He's a communist. He believes in the redistribution of wealth. He does not believe in capitalism. He does not believe in free markets, in private property, none of those things. Okay, so he starts to take all the wealth, as a socialist would do, and to control the economy himself instead of having it be market-oriented. In addition to seizing all of the wealth in Cuba and starting to make it into a socialist society, Castro starts to engage in trade with the Soviet Union. Okay? He starts to engage in trade with the Soviet Union, to do business with the Soviets. In particular, Castro engages in the exchange of sugar for oil. This is a classic scenario of how trade works. Cuba, listen to this carefully, and you'll understand. This is how any trading works, but if you think about this formula, it makes perfect sense. Cuba has sugar, needs oil, right? Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union has oil, needs sugar. Perfect, right? And the Soviet Union is socialist. It's communist, an extreme form of socialism. So there's an ideological pairing, right? It's a natural fit, and they both need something that the other wants. And the Soviet Union likes the idea of making friends with a socialist state that's really close to the United States. Think about what we talked about yesterday. First world, second world, third world. Here's a chance for the Soviet Union to make nice with a third world country right in the doorstep of the United States. So this is perfect for both partners. They kind of strike a deal, a friendship in a sense. From the American point of view, this is very, very dangerous. Okay, so that brings us on your outline then to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before we get to the crisis itself, we still have to lay out some background as to why it came to a head this way. And that means that we have to tell the story very briefly of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Okay? The Bay of Pigs invasion. So, as I was just saying, the United States doesn't like the fact that A, Cuba has become socialist. That's the ideology that the United States is fighting against in the Cold War, and B, that they've made friends, Castro and his buddies, with the Soviet Union. This whole set of developments is unsatisfactory to the United States. So on April 17th of 1961, my date's right, I believe that's correct. A set of, what do you call it, expats. A group of people that we call expats. Expats are Cubans who've left Cuba. Exiles, people who left Cuba when the revolution happened. Cubans who said, you know what, we're out of here. Middle-class Cubans who thought that Castro was a threat to them. When the revolution happened, these expats or exiles left Cuba and they went to Florida because they thought it was in their best interest, because they wanted to stay safe. So what happened was that the United States government, in particular the CIA, what's that stand for? Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA coordinated with these Cubans who were in Florida to try to help them invade Cuba. They set them up with training and information. They provided very close aid and assistance, the CIA did, the United States, to help these Cuban exiles launch an invasion of Cuba. So what they were trying to do is take Cuba back from Castro, basically. Okay. So on April 17th of 1961, this is what happened. What'd I say? April 17th? 1961. You know what? I'm going to have to double check that date. It's good enough for now. The invasion was launched, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion because this is the location of the invasion. It's a bay on the island of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. I don't know if you know this, but in the Caribbean, a lot of the Caribbean and Central American countries have pigs. Wild pigs are native, just like you'd have like deer. They have pigs roaming around. So anyway, so Bay of Pigs is the place where the invasion happened. So the expectation was the exiles who had the help of the CIA, the United States, hoped that they would be able to land in boats, right? Jump off the boats, run up the beach, pew pew pew, right? Shoot a few people. The Cuban people would come out of their homes, greet the invaders warmly, say, "Oh, thank you for saving us from the evil Castro. Give us a gun, right? We're going to join the cause." That's what the invaders at the Bay of Pigs and the United States hoped would happen. That did not happen. This was an epic failure. It was a clown show. It was a joke. It was a disaster. I don't know how to put it any other way. They hit the beach. Castro's soldiers step out of the woods, guns pointed at the invaders. You're under arrest. Bada bing, bada boom. They're in jail. The thing fails. No one comes to their side. It's a terrible miscalculation by the invaders, but also by the United States, because the United States is behind this. They're the ones kind of scheming against the Cubans. So it's an embarrassment. And what it does is it reveals to Castro and the Soviets what the United States really wants to do, right? They kind of show their hand. You guys play cards? You ever play cards? You know how you're supposed to hold your cards, right? And when you're a kid and you first start learning how to play cards, and you're trying to learn how to fan them out in your hands, and the cards are like this, and your dad or your uncle or your mother, say, "No, don't show your cards," right? You have to learn how to not show your cards, because if you do, the other guy can see what you have and can play accordingly. You can think of the Bay of Pigs invasion as the United States showing their cards, revealing to the enemy what their plans are, their designs are. So this is a disaster. What it causes, among other things, is Castro to say, you know what, screw it. I was a socialist before, now I'm communist. So he makes Cuba a full-blown ally of the Soviet Union. Before this, they were just kind of friendly. They were just kind of flirting with each other. But from this point forward, they're like, all right, we're together now. The Soviet Union and Cuba are tight friends, allies. And they're going to coordinate their efforts together. And this is caused by the United States, basically, because we bumbled it around and screwed this thing up. By the way, John F. Kennedy was the president at the time. He's the one who, John F. Kennedy, that was one of your quiz questions. He's the one who ordered the invasion, who approved of this whole thing. So in other words, the situation went from not ideal to really bad, because now basically the Soviet Union is right on America's doorstep. Okay, and with their new buddies, the Soviet Union steps up their efforts to help Cuba and to threaten the United States. They do so by putting missiles on Cuba, missiles that are armed potentially with nuclear weapons. Okay? The Soviet Union began setting up missile sites on the island. How do we know? Well, spy planes, American spy planes, discovered the missiles. These are planes, I don't know if you know what these spy planes look like from the 1950s and 60s. They're almost like gliders. They look like, you know what unmanned aerial vehicles are? UAVs. They use them in modern military. They're like drones, but they're the size of real planes, like huge drones. These were manned. They had a pilot in them, but they have these huge wings so that they can stay aloft for a long, long time. And then they have a camera in the belly of the plane, a high-powered camera, and they take pictures of what's below. We're talking about tens of thousands of feet below. They take what are called aerial photographs. This is what some of the aerial photographs look like. Now that doesn't look like much to you, nor I. If you can kind of make it out, this is what you can imagine what it would look like taking a picture of the Cuban jungle from 10,000 feet in the air. See, these are trees. Like what we think of as satellite photos today. Yeah, absolutely. So you can see a road right here. And there are military experts who are trained in looking at these pictures. They know what they're seeing here. And when the pictures came back to America from the spy planes, the military experts saw this and went, uh-oh, Houston, we have a problem, right? This was very alarming because American military leaders said, those are missiles, okay? Those are missiles that can hit American cities potentially, okay? Missiles launched from Cuba, if they are up and running, and if they are armed with nuclear weapons, which they weren't yet, they could wipe out American cities, right? When nuclear bombs hit cities, the cities are gone. So now this has gone from, oh, gee, it's too bad Batista's gone and Castro's there, to, oh my God, we have a problem that is an existential threat to the United States. Here, existential threat. I'll write that down for you. An existential threat is a threat to your existence. It's the worst kind of threat you can have, if you think about it. So what's the American response? I had it on the screen there just now. They put a blockade in place, okay? That looks something like that. Blockade. Or what they called it back then, a quarantine. You know what a blockade is? It's like a wall of ships, basically, blocking Soviet access to Cuba. A quarantine is, anybody ever heard that word? You know what that is? I'm sure you've heard of it. Can someone define it? A quarantine.
Isolation.
For what purposes? So, what from spreading? A disease. Typically the word is used in terms of the spread of disease. So, was it Ebola that's recently broken out again in Africa? So, yeah, I think it is. So when you have travelers who come to the United States, someone thinks they might have Ebola because they came from one of the regions where there's Ebola. They're quarantined for a certain amount of time. They're forced to stay in basically a little room that's sealed off so they can't spread the disease. That's what this is the word that they use is a quarantine. So the idea is this. It's really simple. Kennedy is saying to the Soviets and the Cubans, you're not going to put any more missiles there. Period. None. In fact, we're going to put our military in between you, Soviet Union, way over here, and the island. It's aircraft carriers, it's destroyers, it's fighter planes. You see the little fighter planes here. Boats all the way around Cuba. It's trying to cut them off completely. It's not trying to. It does. It's an absolute blockade. Now, this is a very, very dangerous situation, right? Because, in fact, when the blockade was put in place, at the same time, at the very moment that the American military went and surrounded Cuba, there were Soviet vessels, ships, en route, on the way to Cuba. They had left Russian ports, and they were literally on the way. So you have Russian naval vessels steaming toward American naval vessels, literally about to encounter each other. Okay? The Cold War was about to become hot, right? Potentially. We've said that the two never shoot at each other. Well, here, they just might start shooting at each other. So this is very, very dangerous because in the era of nuclear weapons, when a Cold War becomes hot, it becomes a nuclear war. And when a nuclear war erupts, you have this phenomenon, or this dynamic. Was this in the textbook?
Yes, but it was like 2 weeks ago.
Before?
Mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction. I don't know. Did we talk about this in class? I don't remember. Mutually assured destruction. If there's a nuclear war, both sides, mutually, that's what mutually means, both sides are guaranteed, right, assured, to be destroyed. Yes, totally. So that's the situation. The way I jokingly say it, and it's not really a joke, and that's what's amazing about this, is that this would be the end of the world. No, actually, the end of the world. This has actually happened, or almost. That's how dangerous this is. Can't possibly be a more dangerous situation on planet Earth, because this would have resulted probably in nuclear war. In hundreds of millions of people would have died. It's a nightmare to even imagine. So this is why they call it the Cuban Missile Crisis, because without a doubt it's a crisis. So for 13 days, and that's the movie that some of you started watching that others will get to pick up on, you have this very, very tense situation where the two sides are about this close to going to war with each other. There's negotiations. There's eventually the two sides agree to not destroy the world. That's good. Let's not kill everyone, including ourselves. The Russians agreed, because basically you can kind of think of it this way. The United States called their bluff, right? The United States stepped in and said, no, seriously, we're willing to go to war over this. We are not going to allow you to put nuclear missiles on this island this close to the United States. So Russia backed down, essentially. The leader of Russia at the time, his title was the Premier, was a man named Nikita Khrushchev. Look at the spelling of that name very carefully. You need to know it for the test. It's a huge pain in the ass. So just like mentally lock it in. It's spelled wrong. Khrushchev, Khrushchev. You don't need to know what KGB stands for, because that would be cruel and unusual for me to do to you. But you do need to know this guy's name, because he's the leader of the Soviet Union. He's the counterpart to JFK in this scenario. So Nikita Khrushchev at the end agreed to withdraw the missiles from the island. The Russians took the missiles off Cuba. In return, the United States promised two things. They promised, one, that they wouldn't invade Cuba again, like they had with this silly Bay of Pigs thing. So the United States had to say, okay, thank you for taking the missiles away. We promise we won't be naughty and try to take over Cuba. But also the United States promised that they would remove some of their missiles from Turkey. There were nuclear equipped missiles parked in Turkey, threatening Russia. So this is one way to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis is to say that this is the closest the world ever came to a nuclear war. And it was very, very close. All right. Does anybody have any questions about this? Okay. So your homework for tomorrow.